Greetings, everyone. Welcome to Financial Activism 101, Moving Money and Power. This is part one of a two-part series, so mark your calendars for our second session, which is scheduled for September 18th. My name is Missouri Colley, and I am the Associate Director for Strategic Partnerships at Women's Foundation California. I'm going to start off with a few details to make sure we're all comfortable in our virtual space. I'm going to introduce you to each of our panelists, and then we will just jump right in. So the first thing is that we have captioning enabled on this call. So if you'd like to use that feature, please turn it on using the toolbar, select more, and then select show captions. Our panelists will have time to respond to your questions. Please use the Q&A feature to pose your question, and we'll address them towards the end of our time together. Also, exciting news, we have exhausted our supply of free books for our event. We have well over 550 registrants for our two-part series. If we were able to accommodate you with a free book, you will receive an email from our partner at bookshop.org, and we're very thankful for their partnership. We also want to thank Candide Group for partnering with us to bring copies of the book to many of you. And also a special thanks to many of you on this call who also donated to support our future economic justice programming. So during our conversation today, we'll be talking about money and power, but also community and solidarity. At Women's Foundation California, we believe that we will get further together. So in addressing systemic inequalities, when talking about redistributing resources and building a more equitable future, we're going to get further through collaboration and partnership. And this event series is a representation of that. We're very, very honored to share space with you and to celebrate the official launch of the Financial Activist Playbook by author and activist Jasmine Rashid. So Jasmine is a financial activist, a writer, and impact investing professional. She successfully supported the Families Belong Together coalition in shifting billions of dollars in big bank financing away from the migrant detention and private prison industry. In her role as Director of Impact for Candide Group, she helps investors flow their money to predominantly women and BIPOC-led social justice-focused companies, funds, and vital organizations building the next economy. So joining Jasmine in conversation, we also have our leader here at Women's Foundation California, our CEO, Vieira. She leads the foundation's work to advance gender, racial, and economic justice. The foundation's program strategy is focused on building community-based power through investing in nonprofit organizations, training community leaders in policy advocacy, and connecting key partners and mobilizing significant financial resources. Prior to being appointed to our CEO in 2023, Bia served the foundation for 5 years as our chief strategist. The foundation was integrated, aligned, and impactful. She has served the nonprofit and philanthropic sectors for more than 20 years. And we also have with us Kimberly Alvarenga, Director at California Domestic Workers Coalition, a longtime partner of WFC, and also one of our newest board members. She has over 20 years of experience growing the economic and political power of underrepresented communities and approaches her work as the daughter of an immigrant domestic worker. Kimberly has championed a number of critical local and statewide issues that impact working families and has extensive expertise in California state policy and advocacy. So Jasmine, Bia, and Kimberly, thank you so much for being here and sharing with us today. And Bia, I will let you take us away. Thank you all.
Thank you, Missouri. And thank you, Jasmine. And thank you, Kimberly. I'm so excited for this conversation today. And Jasmine, first of all, congratulations. I know that this has been a long process. It's been a journey. And we are so excited to have this conversation. I'm so excited for the launch of this book. And the book really talks about all the intersections between power, money, finance, and social justice, thinking about our economy, thinking about our economic system, and how is it that we can make important changes in the system. So can you talk to us a little bit about what inspired you to write the book? How did you come about the idea and your journey about writing the book?
Absolutely. I first want to say thank y'all for holding this space. This is really a dream collaboration come true for me. This book has been many, many years in the making, and I also know that the seeds that led to this book were planted well before I was born. And so just honoring everyone who has contributed to bring this book to light today. So the kind of more immediate inspiration for this book, well, not that immediate, but I grew up really attuned to economic inequality, which is kind of a funny thing for a child to be aware of or angry about, capitalism and wealth inequality before I really had the language for it. But I grew up, like many of us, in a community where wealth inequality was on full display. I grew up on Long Island in New York. People are always surprised because you don't hear my accent, but trust me, it comes out when I'm with my family. But I grew up really seeing, first of all, the proximity to Wall Street and to this financial epicenter of the world, right? And growing up in a suburb that was designed specifically for white flight, that has now since become extremely diverse, but still extremely segregated. It's one of the most segregated places in the US, which people often think of the South, and I think of New York. And I also had this really interesting lens, you know, asking questions about why is there so much inequality? How is this possible? Because I had something that a lot of kids didn't have, which was an in-house financial expert. My dad was a stockbroker on Wall Street, as well as eventually became a certified financial advisor. And so I've always had kind of a in-house bestie to be like, why does this, work like this? Or just be able to express my frustrations around finance and around the economic systems that weren't working for everyday people. And so I had the privilege of going away to college, and I was like, yes, I'll study economics because that'll be the thing that'll help me figure out how to bring more equity into our systems, into our communities. Very quickly realized that my brain doesn't love numbers, doesn't love equations, but it does love stories. I love people stories and really understanding history. And so I changed my major to peace and conflict studies, where I really got to spend my college years just absolutely nerding out and researching social movements throughout history, all of the different strategies and tactics and theories that people in the world are able to use in a grassroots perspective to make massive change in their societies. And often there was a link there, right, between the flow of money and power in some way or another when it came to systems of mass incarceration and apartheid. There's always this role of finance in the background and someone profiting. And so graduated from college, degree in peace and conflict studies, very useful degree. Maybe less so in finding an immediate job, but proved very useful in the kind of current political climate, which for me was in the summer of 2018, which was, as folks remember, really the summer of family separation under Trump's family separation policies and migrant detention. And so graduated into kind of this atmosphere where people, everyday people across the US from all different class, race, gender identities, were paying attention to the ways in which migrants were being locked up, en masse, and began asking questions around how this is possible. And what activists and organizers began pointing out is that the vast majority, over 70% of migrants were being held in for-profit prisons or private corporations that had a business model that was every it was called heads for beds. So every person that was locked up per night meant more money back to shareholders. The incentive.
And there was a
And so
minimum. They had to have a minimum every night to be able to make it. Yeah.
Exactly. And so once people started realizing like, okay, this is not just, this is a really nefarious kind of business model. The fact that it's even a business model and not just seen as a blatant human rights violation is something that became more into public consciousness. And, everyday people didn't have, for example, the ability to step into shareholder meetings with these private prison corporations and the investors who are funding them. But what they did have was access to their own bank accounts, because the vast majority of the private prison financing was by big banks that we knew and trusted with our savings. JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, all of these big banks where we entrusted our livelihoods, we're now using that money to lend out and invest in these private prison companies. So under a coalition banner called Families Belong Together, over 250 organizations across the US, mostly led by moms, both moms who had experienced incarceration as well as moms who hadn't but were standing in solidarity, showed up outside bank headquarters. We had a fun protest on Valentine's Day. This was in 2019, where we delivered petitions in the form of love letters to the banks. We had mariachi bands, serenading with songs of heartbreak. We had really just public displays. At the same time, we had our investor partners actually in conversations with these banks, human rights lawyers with their ESG teams, environmental social governance teams, being like, hey, it's time that prisons are screened out of environmental, social, and governance, right? Like, it's not just about climate, fossil fuels, other human rights abuses. It's time that we add prisons to this mix. And so ultimately, that was my first experience joining a mass campaign and seeing how everyday people could move what ultimately would result in over $2 billion, the vast majority of private prison fundraising, out of the private prison industry, which was, I think, way more than anyone expected. And so that was really exciting. It was a really exhilarating moment. And I think that, there will always be systems that we have to fight against. And I think for me, as someone who really needs hope, I wanted to kind of focus on, how are we not only fighting against these really harmful, violent systems, but how are we also building systems that our communities need? How are we building more joyful, abundant economic systems, vibrant communities? And so that was kind of my intro into the world of impact investing. I've been with Candide for 6 years now, and I'm their director of impact, and really get to focus on how do we move money to companies and funds that are really building the next economy and centering folks who actually understand what it is like to live in the economy and to exist and to raise children and all of these different aspects, right? And so that's been a really great learning experience. I kind of came back to the world of finance and now working in finance, and still very much, not feeling like I totally understood the world of finance, really learning on the job. And also realizing the strategies that we were using in impact investing and philanthropy were not necessarily including everyday people in the conversation, right? Where the vast majority of people are not engaged in this work. And they're also at the same time as trying to, build a better economic future, they're trying to pay their bills. They're trying to sustain their families. Many of us are trying to build generational wealth for the first time, and defining that in a way that actually, leads to care and abundance. And so the book actually came out, to return to the original question. The book actually came out of a blog post that I made the Sunday after George Floyd was murdered by Minneapolis police officers. I was so inspired by the ways in which people were taking to social media and the internet, and in addition to organizing protests in the streets, sharing strategies and tactics where we could collectively build power. And so I put out a blog post that was ways for everyday people, working class, middle class people, to align money with the movement for Black lives. And not only their own money, but all of the money they had access to by virtue of their organizations, their local budgets, their retirement accounts, their religious institutions. And so, it started as a blog post, started getting momentum of different organizations saying, can you come help us do a workshop, help us figure out our financial activist plan? And as a writer and a book nerd at heart, that eventually turned into this project that I cannot believe is finally here today, officially. I'll stop there, but lots of different pieces that went into this book baby entering the world.
Totally. Well, it's a beautiful story. And I know that you also wrote a little bit about the timing, and there's a time for everything. And you talked a little bit about this moment in time. How is it that even more important to think about the power of money and moving money and moving money to community at the same time that we're experiencing so many shifts in the United States. And so I wonder if you can talk just a little bit about the timing and where do you see your book right now having its moment?
Absolutely. So, at the macro level, we're experiencing something called the Great Wealth Transfer, which, I think collectively we're still figuring out what that actually means and looks like, but essentially, trillions of dollars from baby boomers to younger generations, by virtue of them retiring, of them, passing on in this life. And there's massive opportunity for particularly my cohort. I'm a zillennial, proudly. I'm born in the cusp year between Gen Z and millennials. But as more of us are, gaining access to some of this wealth that's being passed down, predictions show that the majority of those trillions of dollars are going to be in the hands of women rather than men for the first time in history. That's personally really exciting. Also, doesn't necessarily mean that we will, immediately turn into this feminist economy, right? Like we need to make sure that we're not recreating the same systems of extractive, patriarchal, white supremacist capitalism. But I do feel a lot of hope in the fact that we know that younger generations are really paying attention to what our dollars are doing in the world. We have access to unparalleled transparency like never before in history about what our money is doing when it's in the bank, when it's in our investment accounts. And there's still a really long way to go in actually demystifying that. And so my role with this book is to begin kind of bringing that conversation again to everyday people who may be on one hand experiencing what it's like to pay down student debt and medical debt, right? But at the same time, want to help build a world actively in which we don't have to navigate those same levels of debt. And that it doesn't have to be a choice between taking care of ourselves, our families, and our communities and helping build collective movements.
Thanks, Jasmine. One of the things about your book that's super interesting is really looking at our own stories about money and at the same time, what were the moments when we identified that money is not neutral and, money and related to power have impact in lives, either our own or others or all of it. And this one, I'm going to say a couple of moments when, for me, that became very clear. And then I'm going to ask Kimberly, and I'm going to ask you to share your stories too. And I grew up in Brazil, also in a country where, when you talk, Jasmine, about inequality, of extreme inequality, and, people hungry on the street, people I grew up with my grandparents and people knocking on the door, asking for food, all of those things. So class, it was something that we as kids were aware of. I don't think we had the language of privilege to understand that, but we totally understood that we were not hungry at night like other people were. And I also grew up under the military, so the IMF, because of being from the global south, the economic instruments of the global north, which are the IMF and the World Bank, are very much part of our daily lives.
Mm.
So, for example, every time Brazil needed a loan, it would go to the IMF. And the IMF would say, yes, you can have this loan if you cut all the subsidies to poor people. There are all the ways that these instruments really impact people's everyday lives. So it seems theoretical, but even as a kid or as a teenager, I was very aware of the power of money and where it was going. So that's one of my stories about money. There are others, but I'm wondering, Kimberly, if you can talk about your moments or opportunities that you had to think about this issue and how it became crystallized for you?
Yes, I grew up in the Mission District in San Francisco, and my mom immigrated from El Salvador, and I had a front row seat to her life, and she worked really hard to make a better life for herself and also for myself. And the first time I actually thought about or had this consciousness about money not being neutral, I would say I was about 16. Um, of course, I've had that front row seat and saw my mom work really hard and struggle, but wasn't really conscious of the impact of money until around that time. My mom was a nanny, and she took care of a child for a doctor that lived in San Francisco and his family. And she uh, not only did that, but she would leave before the sun came up, and she would clean his house as well. And she would iron all the clothes in the house with starch. I remember her talking about her hands hurting a lot when she came home. And it wasn't until later on that she was having challenges communicating with her employer, because my mom was monolingual Spanish speaking. And really soon after that, when I started to interpret for her, I realized that my mom was making less than minimum wage in San Francisco, less than half of minimum wage. And at that time, that really had a really shocking impact on me, because I was of the age where I had started to think about like having a part-time job. And I knew how much minimum wage in San Francisco was. And to just it just hit me like a ton of bricks that my mom, I had made some assumptions too, that my mom had worked so hard, and that I knew how much her work was valued and should be valued. Um, but I was shocked to know that others didn't value and recognize her work in the same way that I did. And that's when I learned that money isn't neutral, that money can be unjust and money can be unfair.
Yeah. How about you, Jasmine?
Yeah, so many stories holding your story and your mother's story, Kimberly. Um, I'll actually share a really recent example that is kind of a funny one, because it seems really obvious and it seems like something I would have been paying attention to, given the work that I do and just my like attention for as long as I can remember to social justice movements. But essentially, I heard about this course called The Trauma of Money. Folks in the room may be familiar with it. Shout out to the Tom community. And I thought, oh, this is something that I really want to take. Essentially, it's an online program for practitioners, whether you're a therapist or financial advisor or wellness coach, really, really diverse group of people who want to infuse trauma-informed practices into their work. And so what that looks like is, how do we collectively decrease shame around conversations related to money and increase discernment, and really, regulate our nervous system so that we can actually engage with money on a more empowered basis. And so I took this course, I signed up to become, a certified practitioner, and I was like, this will be great. I will, really strengthen my toolkit for writing this book, for, working with folks who are looking to reinvest their money, as well as entrepreneurs who are looking to raise money. And I'll be able to really help, my friends and family who are navigating their own financial challenges and really building their financial dreams. I think by the end of the first class, I was very humbled in realizing that I have a lot of my own money trauma that I've never addressed. And this was just a few years ago, and I'm still very much working through. But I think the assumption was that, I never had anything traumatic happen to me, right? I was never, quote unquote, traumatic. I never, experienced houselessness or food scarcity. I, compared to most people in life, experienced a level of upward mobility in, the course of 20-something years that most people don't experience in their lifetimes. And that does not mean that all of our problems related to money evaporated. Personally, I still struggle with a deep scarcity mindset that I know is something that has, been ancestrally seeded. I think about the ways in which, wealth is not just about financial wealth, but also security and sense of identity of who we are in the world, and the ways in which capitalism has made me question my value in the world, right? And so I just bring that up to say that I think the conversations around, money trauma and financial trauma, and the reality that all of us under capitalism are in some form or another experiencing that ongoing trauma all the time, because we are so often pitted against one another, because we, have to question our value. When, for example, we know things like care workers are who make the world go round, the people who tend to our children, our elderly, our disabled. And yet they're not compensated for that work, but the entire economy would crumble without that unpaid labor, right? And so all of that to say that I am still navigating the many ways in which I am really healing my own relationship to money and our financial systems, and reclaiming money as a tool for empowerment rather than, again, scarcity, fear, anxiety, and all of the many things that come with the fact that money is still such a taboo subject in our society. So my work is making it less taboo, making it accessible, making it fun, making it practical, so that people can engage and really reclaim wealth that's been stolen.
Yeah, thank you. That makes me want to have Kimberly maybe talk a little bit about the work at the California Domestic Workers Coalition, and how is it that the financial empowerment, how does that come about? What are the ways in which you are doing this work as part of everything else that you're doing?
Thank you, Bia, and thank you, Jasmine, for this amazing book. I many on the call and the participants know that domestic workers are still excluded from many basic labor protections. So sometimes, talking about economic empowerment can be a little challenging. So I want to say that, but I want to highlight something in Jasmine's book around the strategies, because I had an opportunity to look at the strategies as I was thinking about how the coalition works with our members. Let me just say, you all know that there are approximately 300,000 domestic workers in California that work for about 2 million households. Domestic workers are nannies, house cleaners, caregivers. They're primarily women of color, immigrant women. So it's really important for us to be able to, empower our members. We're a member-based organization. We build power through policy advocacy, grassroots organizing, and at the center is leadership development. So this is where Jasmine's strategy number one that I saw in the book, which is really, it was like, wow, this is what we do in our everyday work as a coalition. It's very simple. Talk about money. And in her book, I'm looking at the quote here. She says, we become equipped to champion, when we talk about money, we become equipped transparency. We challenge economic inequality and empower others to advocate for themselves. And the way that the coalition does this work is that through our Worker Dignity Leadership Program. We don't just do campaigns for the sake of getting a signature, but we are making sure that at every level, our members are building their own leadership. And through that program, we have workshops on how to negotiate with your employer, how to put together a contract, what are the rights of immigrants? What are the overtime laws? we do also trainings on spokespeople training,
Mm.
on coaching, so that our members are actually, yes, we have to continue to change the laws because domestic workers continue to be excluded from many of those laws, but we meet our workers where they are at, and they need that empowerment now.
Mhm.
And so through our work, our members are able to prevent themselves from getting into a situation where they're not getting paid the fair and dignified wages that they deserve. I've seen members say, you know what, that's not enough. My work is more than that. You need to pay me this wage. And then there's a negotiation that happens, and then our members are in a position to prevent wage violations, retaliation that could happen to them because they've had the support and the coaching and the mutual support from each other to be able to take these positions and feel empowered. So 10 hearts to this strategy number 1, which is talk about money. Don't be afraid to talk about money.
I just want to lift up too. I think that one of the things that really blew my mind in the research for the book was just how extreme of a problem wage theft is.
Mhm.
Don't talk about it, and it's something that most of us don't know about. Like we hear terms like theft, and we think, oh, credit card fraud, or robbing a store, when really the people not getting their adequate wages is a massive problem. One of the biggest problems, financial thefts that we experience as a whole. And it's not only just for domestic workers, or it's definitely something that is concentrated among people who are most vulnerable, right? People who may have language barriers or documentation barriers or be formally incarcerated, but it's actually a problem that permeates every level of society. And it's part of the larger trend that I talk about in the book, which is financialization, which is essentially the process of the ways in which financial systems have engineered their way into every aspect of our everyday life, from, who owns our childcare facilities to where we take our pets to the vet, are owned by these private equity firms and other financial managers whose explicit job is to direct wealth away from the wages of everyday working class people and middle class people to the billionaire class, right? This is the strategy that the billionaire class is using. And wage theft is a really big part of that is just not normalized or talked about in society. So,
and it takes a lot of courage,
It does.
especially when someone is underrepresented, or even us in our everyday lives as women or women of color, like the challenges to just, should I say something, or should I demand what I think I deserve, and I know for domestic workers, it's like a unique industry. It's behind closed doors. It is
Mhm.
private. A lot of our members are undocumented, and the power dynamic that exists. So the courage to speak and to talk about money and be transparent about it is takes a lot of effort.
and it takes people power, right? Because one person alone is not going, to have that same force. But when we organize, right, this is a shout out to unions. This is a shout out to all the legacies of mutual aid work, in which people can really build power and flex that, without us and our collective work, the economy would fall into pieces. And so really using that to our advantage in the kind of larger struggle for organizing is something that we still have a long way to go, but I've seen so much momentum around. I can actually share one example of
That'd be great.
on an international level that I thought was really interesting, which was, so my dad's from Bangladesh, and people may know that Bangladesh is one of the biggest exporters of garments in the world, right? Like check the tag on whatever clothes you're wearing, there's a good chance it's from Bangladesh. During the pandemic, and this was completely new learning to me, the way that our international supply chains are set up is that factories often bear the initial costs of production, and then they wait months for reimbursement from these really powerful brands. So when the pandemic struck, big brands just canceled their orders, but they had already been made. Like all of these clothes had already been made. So over 1 million garment workers in places like Bangladesh, Myanmar, Cambodia, Vietnam, many of whom were almost all of whom were women, many of whom were primary breadwinners for their households as well as mothers, were left unemployed with no financial safety nets, which equated to $40 billion in unpaid wages, just because these big brands said we could, right? We are in the powerful position where we don't actually have to be accountable to people, which resulted in 8 years worth of salary for over 4 million Bangladeshi women garment workers being unpaid. Like that's a huge, that's like numbers again, like are really hard, I think, to fathom, but it was something that absolutely devastated so many communities. And this is where financial activism from everyday people came into play, where people around the world began paying attention to this on social media. Don't quite know how it started, but I know that the Workers' Rights Consortium and the Remake, it's a nonprofit organization, really began leveraging this hashtag pay up and tagging brands like H&M, Target, Zara. And the hashtag really went viral actually when social media users began pointing out on Instagram, on TikTok, that Kendall and Kylie Jenner's clothing line were complicit in the wage theft. And so this, I think, is a really interesting example of like influencers meet influence, right? Where there began all this pressure. And eventually, the majority of these brands actually began, once they were put on notice, over the course of 2 years, this pay up campaign that happened, somewhat organically, but also was deeply organized, recouped $22 billion with a B for these garment workers. And so just to show an example of like how devastating, the effects of wage theft can be, and also how powerful it is when, even if we don't have financial capital to, repay those wages, we have our voices, we have tools of influence and levers of influence like social media, like the ability to organize, that can be really, really powerful in holding these brands accountable collectively.
Yeah, that's a great example. Yeah. I wonder, Kimberly, if you want to talk a little bit about just the barriers that you see for the work that you're doing, for talking about money, for thinking about economic security for domestic workers, and how can we support that work? How can we be part of this work?
Thank you so much for the opportunity to share some of the work that the coalition is doing. I mentioned it earlier in the call, this legacy of racism, legacy of enslavement, legacy of sexism that exists, that really keeps domestic workers from having the same rights that other workers have. And we're, like I mentioned, a member-led organization, so our members keep raising these issues up as one of the most important barriers for them. Because when situations do happen, they don't have any recourse. They don't have anywhere to legally be able to go and get the support and backup that they need. And so our priority, based on our members' desire for the last few years, has been the issue of health and safety. Domestic workers are the only industry that is still excluded from basic occupational health and safety rights. And we have been campaigning for a number of years to bring recognition, because this is bigger than health and safety. It's about recognizing the labor and the work that I think Jasmine mentioned that is so important, and it's the work that makes all other work possible. And so it's very important. It should be valued, and domestic workers should have the same health and safety rights. So how could folks on the call help today? Well, we've taken a significant step this year. We're really glad to report that we have a bill, SB 1350, that even as we speak is on Governor Newsom's desk. And it's not everything we want. We know change is incremental, and it's especially around policy, it's not everything that we want, but it's a significant step forward. It would actually bring California into compliance with the federal government, and it would provide health and safety protections for at least 175,000 domestic workers in
Wow.
California that work for agencies. And that is the step that this would take. So I would invite everybody to maybe visit our Facebook page where we have the emoji or the meme that shows the governor's phone number, and also a little script. Because he has until September 30th, I think, to sign or veto bills. So please join us and call up the governor and tell him, hey, sign the bill. So thank you so much for the opportunity, Bia. Thank you, Jasmine.
Of course. Thank you, Kimberly. And of course, we are putting on the chat more information about the campaign and where to find information and the phone number. We would love to have folks support this bill. And as Kimberly said, it's a step. It's a step in the right direction. And difficult to believe that that this is where we are. Difficult to believe. I wanted to shift a little bit our conversation and talk. I guess I wanted to share a couple of things about how we at the Women's Foundation of California have thought about financial advocacy, how we think about our business model is not really a wonderful thing to say, but it is. How we've looked at ourselves and thought about all the resources that we have, because we know philanthropy is an area, a field that, came from banking, really very specific ways that it has it's a challenging field sometimes. Let's put it that way. And I think that for us in the last, especially right before, but after COVID, it was so clear. If it wasn't cleared before, it became crystal clear the inequalities in the United States, how something like the government response impacted everyone's lives, how our lives were impacted differently in terms of privilege, in terms of who could stay home and who couldn't, and who was more at risk. And so we looked at ourselves, and I would say it's not necessarily because of that, but we were in a process anyways of looking at everything, all of our resources, including not just our, the grants that go out or the leadership institutes that we have, but thinking about what bank are we using? Who is making decisions about where money is being invested? What kinds of screens are folks using to invest our money? And it's not that we weren't aware of that before. We were, but we were, I think, at that point in a position to more deeply and really think about all of our policies. For example, our commitment to staff in terms of retirement plans. Where is that money going? How are we also helping staff figure out ways and places and who's making decisions about their money? So we went through a process that we are not finished yet, but that we are really thinking about all of our resources and what parts of our resources are working against our values and our mission. So that for us is something that we're constantly thinking about, but also understanding that we live in the system, this capitalist system, and, making, I guess compromise is not the right word, but that we are trying our best to make sure that we are stewarding this money in a way that is benefiting community in the best way possible. And part of this work is questioning like our role and what systems do we have ourselves? Who do we work with? all of those things. And I guess one of the questions, Jasmine, and I know you have written about this, is that, living in these moments of contradiction, of like living within a system that is harmful, and we understand how it's harmful and how are we participating or not. And I'm wondering also about how you are thinking about the ways in which to be able to make massive shifts in our economic system and how we think about our economy and how we move to abundance, how it also requires giving up some power in certain ways for some folks. So I hope that makes sense, the question.
It's a lot to chew on, and I'll do my best to try and tackle different parts of it. But I mean, I just want to ground us in the fact that, yes, to live under capitalism is to navigate contradictions every day and to make choices. And I think where so many of us, and I know I've caught myself in this, is we get caught up in the shame around the fact that we can't do everything perfectly, right? That we can't, you know, click a button and immediately align all of our finances with our values. That is not how the system was set up, and it does prey on everyday people not engaging with it because they feel shame or confusion or embarrassment, whatever it may be. And so I really try to take an asset-based approach of looking at all the opportunities we have to make change in the book. And I think we'll probably talk about this a little later, but the next session, the workshop session on the 18th, is really going to be diving into the strategies. But just to give folks a quick overview, the strategies are talking about money, which Kim mentioned, banking, buying, giving and receiving, showing up for one another, really outside of just financial wealth, but also different forms of capital, shifting budgets, investing and everything that comes with that, and handling business, actually designing businesses that align with our values. So the book is very much a choose your own adventure in that it is extremely descriptive, but not prescriptive. It's not saying, here's the 5 things that you need to do in order to be like a financial activist. Like that, I think, is actually one, lazy, and 2, would be reinforcing, I think, our current culture, patriarchal culture, that is very power dynamic, top down, in terms of here's what you need to do to be right, when we live in a much more complicated, nuanced, beautiful world in which what is going to work for one person is not necessarily what works for another person. So I really help people think through understanding their own context, putting themselves in context, understanding their own financial situations, mapping the network of resources and wealth that they have around them, and moving from there. Because what I've heard time and again, and just to double click on the point you brought up, Via, is that, when I started talking about this, so often I heard people saying, the reason we never, added a ESG screen to our retirement plans is because no one asked HR. Like, no one asked, right? Or the reason that, we aren't assessing our supply chains is because there hasn't been a push, right? And so this is the power of everyday people, to ask questions, to bring that lens of curiosity, and just to experiment with different ways of doing things. And always reminding ourselves that our current financial systems and norms and culture were man-made, right? They were literally made by a very small group of men, of landowning white men, in a very particular context, that could have never imagined the vibrant, multiracial, gender full society that we live in today, right? They could have never pictured the 3 of us on this Zoom screen and all the people who are showing up and sharing space with us. And so it is our work to recreate and redesign those systems. And again, it can be very daunting. Like, there are so many opportunities, asset-based approach, so many challenges, but so many opportunities that we can begin to tackle. And so what I really encourage people is, throughout the book, I offer this 5-step framework that really folks can use in whatever financial activist situation they find themselves in. The first step is just questioning. Why is this like this? So let's say you're driving through your neighborhood and you notice that all of the banks are closing down, but all of the check cashing places opening up. Or maybe you begin to question, let's take the example of retirement. deeply unsexy concept, but really, really, really important because it's about dignity and about our ability to live our lives through the entirety of our lives to the fullest. So questioning, for example, why do the majority of millennials and Gen Z not save for retirement or not even think about retirement? And checking in about it on a personal level. So maybe thinking about your own situation. What comes up for you when you think about retirement and what needs to be saved for retirement? You know, being honest with yourself about the emotions that may come up. Is it boredom? Is it fear? This is a really important step, the second step of checking in, because often in activist and organizing spaces, and I say this with deep love, we are so ready to begin solving problems that we often skip over the harder work of being tender with ourselves and one another. That work is really important because when we skip over, we often see, situations in which we then project our own trauma onto other people who are on the same team as us, right? And so questioning why things are like this, checking in about it, and then we get into the really fun third step, which is where I really lean on my creatives and pull in the folks who think expansively about mapping what's possible. And this is just an experiment in really not saying, okay, here's what's most practical or what's most accessible in this moment, but really beginning to just imagine and explore and envision what would it be like if we didn't have to worry about saving for retirement? What if we knew we had a social safety net? What would that feel like? Well, how would that change the ways in which we work today? And so again, just beginning to imagine and envision. And that leads us and gets us ready for the fourth step, is asking yourself, what can I do right now? And that's the very kind of looking at your own situation and thinking, okay, I cannot do everything. Not everything is my job to do, but what is one thing I can do right now to put myself in a better financial situation so that I'm also being a part of collective community wealth building, and knowing that we can't exclude ourselves in that conversation of collective community wealth building. We all have a role to play. And so,
And
one thing I've
Jasmine,
heard.
can you say a little bit more about collective community wealth building?
So
Just
I
for
will say,
maybe there are a couple of folks that haven't quite heard it that way.
sure. So I will premise this by saying that the way that financial literacy, if and when it is even brought up in conversation, is shared is really about individuals, right? It's really about, falling into this paradigm of winners take all, get what you can, focus on yourself, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, whatever, good American metaphor you want to use. But what we know, which we know from indigenous wisdom, from nature, the fact that environments and ecosystems need to rely on one another, is that we need to act cooperatively. We need to be thinking about not only our own financial well-being, but the financial ecosystems around us, and making sure that they are well, or else we're never going to actually be able to live in societies that have the systems of care and abundance that we're thinking about. And so when I use terms like collective wealth building, I'm thinking about ways that we are not choosing between ourselves and what our needs are in this moment, right? How do I eat in this moment? But how do I make sure I build a world in which everyone eats? Those are inextricably, in my mind, connected. And so coming back to the example of how we go from that individual to that collective work, asking yourself what I can do right now, coming back to, again, this example of retirement, I think the stats are only a quarter of people who work in a organization, in a company that have access to employee-sponsored retirement plans and matching plans. Only a quarter of them actually use it. Why? Because it's not talked about, because people don't know that's an option, because it's not, the top of mind for HR, whoever's in that corporation, to say like, hey, here's some free money on the table. You should probably grab it, right? And so maybe for you, even as you're kind of navigating like the existential, challenges of the retirement system, making sure that you're at least tending to yourself, maybe that is taking advantage of the retirement sponsored employment plan. And then we can get into the conversations about how do we make sure that those retirement plans are actually investing in things that are aligned with our values and not destroying the planet, incarcerating people, contributing to militarization, and so on. So taking one easy step, which leads to the fifth step, which is the more broad and kind of final step of reaching financial activism is asking your community, what can we do together? So at the same time as you're taking individual steps to secure your own well-being and financial stability, thinking about the ways in which we can collectively organize. For example, if we were to tax the ultra wealthy 1% more, if you know, and for some of them that's nothing, we would be able to replenish Social Security in ways that would make a massive difference for the lives of everyone, right? Like there are pressure points that we know there are solutions in which we can pretty quickly fill up some of these safety nets that have been there for previous generations. And so, yeah, I've gone off on a little bit of a retirement tangent, but I think it's a good example
Yeah, it is.
of our
Yeah.
lives.
Thank you. I wonder if folks on the call, on the webinar, have questions. And I'm wondering if Missouri can help us with questions if there are any, or even if Missouri, you have a question.
I'm gonna share out some of the questions we've gotten from our audience. I do want to just preface this to say that we won't be able to answer every question, and those of you who don't get your question answered, please join us on the 18th for the interactive workshop. There'll be more time and space to get those questions out and answered. So I am going to answer this first one. And it's just in addition to the Financial Activist Playbook, are there some other books that Jasmine, Bia, or Kimberly would recommend around these issues that we spoke about?
I have many, many recommendations, many of which you can find in the back of my book in the kind of reference list, because again, this book is a product of curating and collecting collective wisdom, some of which is in the form of books, others are in the form of oral storytelling. But I actually just put together a Reclaiming Wealth and Collective Wellbeing book list that I can share the link to afterwards, but it includes some great titles like Braiding Sweetgrass, which is about really leaning on biomimicry and indigenous wisdom of ways to be in economy with one another and to build robust systems of safety and wealth. It includes The Social Justice Investor, which is a recent book that just came out a few months ago. It includes Money Out Loud, which is a book by Berna Annette, who's a Bay Area local financial hype woman who is just a really fun read about, you know, taking financial literacy from, again, this kind of academic or dogmatic approach to something that is really actually enjoyable and fun. And so, yeah, I have a whole list that I'm happy to share with folks, but really curious what resonates for Bia and Kim.
Kimberly, I don't have more to add.
Neither do I at this point.
Okay. All right, so let's go to the next one, and we'll make sure that we get that list that Jasmine's curated out to everyone. This next question is, can we hear more about how we change the narrative of how financial stories are told or not told and framed? For example, claims that shoplifting is allowed in California versus the prevalence of wage theft. One is talked about as if it's the problem of our times, and the other is barely talked about.
I will just start by saying that in order to change the narrative, we need to change the narrators. You know, and there's a lot that could be unpacked there in terms of who owns media, right? Like who is actually profiting from different forms of messaging. But I think in general, like something that pretty obviously I want to see more of in our world is bridging the worlds of creativity and narrative storytelling and media with the worlds of finance and economics, because we see them as so diametrically either opposite or far away from each other, when in fact we're able to bring both of these really important topics together. We find really innovative ways to do creative storytelling. One organization I want to highlight is Narratives Unbound, which my friend Nafasi
Great.
Farrell
Yeah.
runs, which is really just about like, how do we think about not only our money stories, but also our, ancestral stories? Like, again, putting ourselves in context. How do we think about the reality and telling the stories of what's actually happening in our financial systems in ways that are going to resonate with folks? Because we don't want to invalidate people's experiences in terms of what is live and real for them, but we also want to ground it in, larger reality around what are the most pressing issues of our times that we actually do need more collective energy around, where we do have the potential to make a really big difference, rather than just points that feel like frustration points that there isn't actionable steps in the same way to work on. So that's what I'll say for now, but I'll pass it on.
Yeah, I think Kimberly, I'm sure can talk more specifically about it, but I think for me, the issue of narrative is also the issue of community building and organizing, because we talk about our stories. We may not sometimes know exactly that this is my story of money, but we have our stories of how we got here, or how I got here, and how my got here, and what's embedded in that, and the idea that together we can think about ways that as we are looking at, as movement, as a feminist movement, how is it that in every opportunity amongst ourselves, we are thinking about what kind of narratives are we reinforcing right now? What kind of narratives? Because we, I think, have enough understanding that we are impacted by, the overall macro narratives that are coming to us, but in fact, our lived experiences are telling maybe something a little bit different. And how do you tap into that?
Yeah, I can, traditionally, like as a coalition, every time we've always made sure that every meeting that we have, every lobby meeting, there's a worker that's telling her own story. And I think folks know that. But I think what we've learned a lot from is when we started to do story circles. And we did that with the thinking that, spokespeople, right? Our members are going to be spokespeople for their issues. But when we got them together and they started to tell their stories, I feel like from what our organizers were sharing with me is that they began to see each other in each other and began to connect with their experiences as immigrants, as women, as mothers. And we started to see a real desire for additional issues around healing of trauma, and cultural work that is springing up from those circles. So I think to Bia's point, like there's so much power in telling our own stories, but and also like connecting it to the greater good and to the greater community, and that in itself is like powerful and leads to even deeper things.
Thank you all. So we have time for a few more, so I'm going to get those out. This question is, what advice do you have for people anticipating significant wealth transfer as far as getting ready, giving long-term versus short-term versus impact investing, etc.?
Yes, so I love that question, especially as someone who works with both everyday people, but also high net worth or people, primarily women who are experiencing, massive wealth transfers and wanting to be responsible stewards of that wealth, especially wealth maybe they don't feel like is fully theirs because it was generated, like all wealth, on through the labor of others. And how do we actually honor that labor? I think that finding supportive spaces for you to process your own, just like I was saying, with like starting with like the feelings around that money. I again, often see people skip that part to get straight to the tactical, and it doesn't always turn out great. And so encouraging people to really lean on spaces, specifically in that scenario where are able to be around both peers, people who are going through the same, or similar experience with you, as well as people who are from very different experiences than you, that may understand what's actually needed on the ground, because we know that the people closest to the problems are the people closest to solutions. They're just not always the ones closest to the capital to enact said solutions. And so you have a really interesting opportunity to help bridge that gap. One space I will highlight is the really amazing gathering that I got to be a part of earlier this year between Women's Foundation California and Just Economy Institute, called Our Money Ourselves, which is a space specifically curated to talk about money stories and really start to get some practical action steps in place around ways to redistribute, transfer, and move wealth, while also making sure that you're tending to your own needs, your family's needs, and so on.
Okay, let's see. Thank you for that. And another one is, do you have any suggestions on how to advocate for a socially responsible retirement plan at nonprofit organizations where HR capacity tends to be very limited?
Yeah, I have an example in my book that hopefully is a very kind of practical, just walk through of like, here's some questions to ask. Here's, the power of persistence and, pulling other, coworkers and making sure that this is a collective priority. Because it does, sometimes, squeaky wheel gets the, what is it? Oil?
I'm not good with these things.
To be course. So there are different resources out there. I'm happy to share more, but a lot of it is just practice and scripts, and really just knowing what to advocate for. And that doesn't mean you have to have all of the answers, but I think, again, elevating it to the level where it does become a priority is something that takes a little bit of persistence often.
I would say also find out peer organizations that have done it. And then sometimes in an organization, leadership might think, oh, this is not possible, without understanding where the opportunities are, just because people are, it's complicated. It's complicated meaning life is complicated, and the organization, you're doing your job. And so I think finding organizations that are peers that have done it and understanding how they've done it. And of course, we can, not that we have all the answers, but we certainly can be a place where folks can come to in terms of resources that we can share what our experience has been.
Nice, thank you. And the next one is, when you talk about mapping what's possible, can you walk us through a robust example?
I can
Yeah,
share an example.
go
Yeah.
ahead. Yeah.
I'm dying to share this example because I found another quote from Jasmine, I think from her book, and it's the definition of financial activism. And it says, I'm reading it here. It says, financial activism is how everyday people radically imagine money as a tool for widespread well-being instead of a weapon of absurdity, increasing inequality.
Yeah.
And we at the coalition, during the Trump administration, we did listening sessions across the state, and our members were just like, you can imagine how they were feeling with the anti-immigrant sentiment. And we asked them what they needed, and they said, you know what, we are still excluded from so many rights. And then the domestic workers that have rights don't know that they are protected. And we thought, you know what, like all these corporations, like they have proposals for money. They set off on making sure the state of California, supports their issues. And it's a statement. How a state spends its money is a statement of their values. And and then we had questions like, who makes these decisions? Who holds the wallet? What is the process? And we started envisioning a program. Like, how do we start a program with the Labor Commissioner's Office that's never existed and actually get the state of California to fund it? And out of nothing, to Jasmine's quote, we envisioned something, we reimagined that money, and we actually asked for everything that we thought it would take to do it over 5 years. And we reimagined $35 million because that's what domestic workers actually deserve, because they're excluded, because they've never had a program, because no one like actually does the work to help enforce their rights and compliance. And maybe that would help reach more workers and actually do the training that we need to build leadership. We won the money. We won the money. We won the resources because our members were inspired and they spurred us on that it's something that they needed. And to Jasmine's book and Jasmine's point, like, we imagined something that we never had done before. And we engaged in the process of budget advocacy, and we learned how these decisions are made behind closed doors most of the time. But we engaged and we organized and we learned from our mistakes until we achieved our goal. So just shout out to her definition of financial activism.
Wow.
Chills.
I know. It's powerful.
Well, we're gonna pause on the questions for now. I think we can save them and bring them up at the next session on the 18th, but I'll leave the floor back to all of you as we close out.
Yeah. Well, to close out, what is a couple of what's come up for you in this conversation that has inspired you and that you are going to bring to the next session?
I'm still sitting with. Oh, go ahead, Kim.
I just appreciate you, Jasmine, and the tool. You know that it really is nice to see our work kind of validated through the principles and the things that you have in the book. And I'm looking forward to reading all of it and yeah, and applying it to the work that we do.
Yeah, so mutual. I just wanted to lift up. I've already learned so much from you, Kimberly, and excited to keep learning from you and all the work that your coalition has really been leaders on. Yeah, there's so many things that I want to say, but I think I'm sitting with this idea of what if we actually asked for what we needed? Right? Like what might be possible? What portals of opportunity might that open up? I'm thinking about, so many of these great questions that people brought in that I'm excited to hopefully have time to be able to really tend to, because again, there's so much power in just asking questions around things that have been normalized in our financial system. That is fundamentally how change happens, when we begin to question, bring a lens of curiosity, and then begin experimenting. And what else do I want to kind of close this out with? I mean, this book is very much, a practical, accessible playbook. It's a playbook for a reason, because it invites in joy and play, and it's not a textbook. But it's also a love letter to the underestimated who have moved, countless wealth against all odds, against oppressive systems, to community care and abundance, who have found ways outside of the traditional financial system to survive, and not only survive, but thrive. And so the book is really full. It was just kind of an opportunity, for me selfishly, to just love on all of the amazing organizers and coalitions who don't get the shine, who do not, get named in national media or even sometimes local media, but have made massive impact on people's lives. And so I saw some questions around, what are the coalitions that we can join? What are the organizations? And even just hearing that as a question brings me so much hope, because it shows that there is a desire to connect with others around these issues in ways that build real power and real momentum. And so the next session will be full of pairing with each of those 8 strategies, some examples of coalitions and support groups that you can go to depending on your experience, whether you are someone who's, for example, a wealth holder, whether you're someone who's trying to build wealth for the first time. There's something for everyone, whether you're an elder or a youth. There are really, really amazing organizing spaces for people to get connected, get plugged in, and begin reclaiming wealth.
Oh, thank you. I think for me, what's so inspiring about this conversation and your book and the work is that it's this moment that we're in. We are in a very particular moment in the United States, and we are in this moment that being together really is what's going to save us. And I don't mean to be catastrophic, but it is really what's going to be able to create what's the new society, the new community, how we want to be structured. This is the time. I mean, this is a moment for us to really come together, and it fills me with really a lot of love and a lot of inspiration for what we can do together. And I am grateful, super grateful to you, Jasmine, and to you, Kimberly, for being part of our community at the Women's Foundation of California, for being part of this this dream that together we can ask for what we want once and get it. So thank you.
Thank you, Bia. Thank you to the Women's Foundation.
Thank
you.
Thank you, Missouri.
Comienzo a sentir la verdad de la realidad, las cosas que me sorprendían hoy en